The Galactic Expedition Corps had a sterling reputation for planetary surveys, which was impressive considering they'd only been around for 3 centuries and had already managed to catalogue over 4,000 worlds without losing more than a dozen teams. Their success rate hovered at 99.7%, a number they plastered across every recruitment holoboard from the core worlds to the Rim. What those holoboards conveniently failed to mention was that the remaining 0.3% had a nasty habit of becoming cautionary tales, whispered in academy halls after lights out. Verdantia 7 was supposed to be routine. The planet checked all the boxes for easy classification: breathable atmosphere, negligible predator population, abundant water sources, and vegetation that wouldn't actively try to digest survey teams. On paper, it was a paradise world waiting for an exploitation license. The jungle covering 70% of its surface seemed picturesque in orbital scans, all emerald canopy and winding rivers that sparkled like scattered diamonds. Nobody bothered to mention that what looked like a pleasant forest from space translated to an impenetrable nightmare of vegetation so thick that sunlight became a theoretical concept. The expedition team consisted of 6 members, carefully selected to represent the diversity of the galactic community. There was Kern, a Vextali whose species evolved in crystalline cave systems and possessed natural sonar that could map terrain through solid rock. Tremendously useful in caves, somewhat less so when the problem involved distinguishing one tree from 8 trillion identical siblings. Jolpak, a Metharian with 4 arms and computational abilities that made standard ship computers look like counting frames, served as their navigator. His species had mapped 30% of known space, which seemed impressive until one considered they'd also managed to get lost in a supply closet on the flagship 3 times during this mission alone. Preen, their xenobotanist, belonged to a species that photosynthesized and communicated through color shifts in their skin. Theoretically, this made them perfect for jungle environments. Practically, it meant Preen spent most of their time trying not to accidentally proposing marriage to local flora through unfortunate pigmentation choices. Quillix, a floating gasbag species from a low-gravity world, served as their aerial scout. The Quillix had evolved in planet-wide cloud layers and possessed 360-degree vision, excellent for spotting things from above, decidedly problematic when above became a solid ceiling of leaves so dense that visibility measured in inches rather than miles. Then there was Morrow, the human. Expedition teams included humans for reasons that remained diplomatically vague in official documentation, but boiled down to 3 universally acknowledged facts. They were durable, adaptable, and possessed a disturbing tendency to treat near-death experiences as interesting anecdotes rather than trauma requiring therapy. Morrow had signed up for the Corps after spending 5 years as a wilderness guide on Earth, which meant they had relevant experience. It also meant they possessed the kind of cheerful insanity that made other species nervous. The 6th member, their pilot and technical officer Ven, had stayed with the shuttle at base camp because someone needed to maintain contact with the orbital survey ship. This decision would later be recognized as the only intelligent choice anyone made that week. The mission parameters seemed straightforward enough to border on insulting. The team would trek 15 kilometers into the jungle, establish sample collection points at 5-kilometer intervals, and return within 3 planetary rotations. Simple, clean. The kind of operation a competent team could complete blindfolded. The first 5 kilometers went perfectly, which should have been everyone's first warning. The jungle trail, while not exactly a paved highway, remained visible and navigable. The team collected samples, Preen made excited color flashes at particularly interesting fungi, and Kruen's sonar painted detailed maps of the underground root systems. Morrow walked point, occasionally pausing to examine broken branches or disturbed soil with the intense focus of someone who actually understood what they were looking at. The others found this vaguely unsettling, but appreciated not walking into anything immediately lethal. The second 5 kilometers introduced complications. The trail became suggestion rather than reality, a faint line through undergrowth that seemed to actively close behind them. Joel Pack's navigational computers started hiccuping, displaying coordinates that drifted like drunken butterflies. He insisted this was normal, just some localized magnetic interference. His species had been insisting things were normal for 3 centuries while getting catastrophically lost, so this confidence inspired exactly zero reassurance. By kilometer 12, the trail had vanished entirely. The jungle pressed in from all sides, a living wall of vegetation that seemed to regenerate faster than they could push through it. Visibility dropped to arm's length. The canopy overhead blocked 98% of sunlight, transforming day into perpetual twilight. Kruen's sonar pinged uselessly against too many surfaces, returning echoes that painted nothing but visual static. Quillix couldn't rise above the understory without getting tangled in vines that apparently possessed both tensile strength and vindictive personalities. When Joel Pack finally admitted his navigation systems had completely failed, the announcement surprised absolutely nobody. His forearms gestured helplessly at instruments displaying coordinates that placed them simultaneously at base camp, 300 meters underwater, and somehow orbiting the planet's third moon. The magnetic interference had evolved from localized annoyance to reality-denying nightmare. Panic spread through the group with impressive speed. Kruen's crystalline structure began producing stress fractures that pinged audibly. Preen shifted through colors representing various stages of existential dread. Joel Pack calculated probability matrices for survival that grew increasingly depressing with each iteration. Quillix deflated slightly, hovering closer to the ground as if proximity to soil would provide comfort. Morrow, meanwhile, looked up. This simple action would later be analyzed by xenopsychologists as a perfect example of divergent evolutionary problem-solving. When most species encountered danger at ground level, instinct drove them to seek shelter in caves, burrows, or fortified positions at or below surface elevation. Humans, who'd evolved climbing trees to escape predators and subsequently developed an inexplicable fondness for altitude despite lacking any physical adaptations for it, possessed the apparently unique instinct to go vertical when horizontal failed. "We need to get off the ground," Morrow announced with the calm certainty of someone about to suggest something either brilliant or catastrophically stupid. The others stared. Kruen's sonar pinged questioningly. Preen flashed colors that roughly translated to elaborate on that madness. Joel Pack's computational abilities ground to a halt trying to process the suggestion. "The canopy," Morrow continued, gesturing upward into the gloom where tree trunks disappeared into shadow. "We can't navigate down here, but up there we might be able to see something useful. Plus, the ground is getting worse." They pointed at the soil, which had indeed become increasingly waterlogged and unstable over the past kilometer. Several team members had already sunk ankle-deep in patches of swampy muck that smelled like decomposition and poor life choices. "Humans," Kern clicked, their translator rendering appropriate skepticism. "Your species evolved from arboreal ancestors, yes? The rest of us did not. Your solution is to climb toward problems rather than away from them. We evolved from arboreal ancestors who climbed to escape problems," Morrow corrected. "Big difference." And unless someone has a better idea, we're either going up or we're sitting here until we die or get rescued, whichever comes first. I'm betting on death. The rescue time frame doesn't activate for another 40 hours. This cheerful assessment of their situation didn't improve morale, but it did possess the uncomfortable ring of accuracy. The team carried supplies for 5 days, but those calculations assumed access to water sources that now existed somewhere in the indistinguishable mass of vegetation around them. The ground continued its transformation into swamp. Night would bring temperature drops their equipment could handle but wouldn't enjoy. "I cannot climb," Joel Pack stated flatly. His species possessed 4 arms, but they'd evolved for manipulation, not locomotion. "My body structure makes vertical ascent impossible. Vextali do not climb," Kern added. "Our crystalline structure lacks the necessary flexibility." Quillix remained silent, possibly because floating species didn't need to announce their climbing limitations. Preen shifted through colors before settling on one that indicated reluctant agreement. "My species can manage vertical surfaces, but slowly. Very slowly." Morrow nodded, already scanning the massive tree trunks surrounding them. "Right. So here's what happens. I go up, establish a platform, rig a pulley system using the cable in our equipment packs, and haul everyone else to safety. Simple." The fact that this plan sounded simultaneously insane and like their only option summed up the situation perfectly. Before anyone could mount coherent objections, Morrow approached the largest nearby tree, a giant whose trunk measured at least 4 meters in diameter. The bark looked rough enough to provide handholds, and lower branches started about 8 meters up. For a human with rock climbing experience, this translated to challenging but manageable. For the others, it might as well have been a smooth glass wall extending into infinity. Morrow jumped, caught a slight protrusion in the bark, and began climbing. Their movements looked effortless, weight shifting smoothly as hands and feet found purchase on surfaces that shouldn't have supported anything. The other team members watched with the fascinated horror of species witnessing something they intellectually understood but couldn't instinctively grasp. Humans climbed things. Everyone knew this. Watching them actually do it triggered responses ranging from admiration to visceral fear. Kern's sonar tracked Morrow's ascent, painting a picture of steady upward progress. 5 meters, 8 meters, 12 meters. At 15 meters, Morrow reached the lowest branch, a horizontal limb wider than most species were tall. They hauled themselves onto it, took a moment to catch their breath, then disappeared into the foliage above. For the next hour, the ground team waited while ominous sounds of human activity filtered down from the canopy. Snapping branches, muttered cursing. At one point, something large crashed through leaves before Morrow's voice called down, "I'm fine." Branch was rotten. This did not inspire confidence. Eventually, a cable dropped from above, landing in a coil at their feet. Morrow's face appeared through a gap in the leaves, barely visible in the gloom. "All right, I've got a platform established and a pulley rigged. Who wants to go first?" "Platform," Joel Pack called up, his translator managing to convey profound skepticism. "You constructed a platform in under an hour, lashed some branches together with equipment straps and cable. It'll hold." "Probably. Send up the lightest person first in case I'm wrong about weight distribution." This inspired exactly zero confidence, but alternatives remained distinctly lacking. Preen, being lightest, got strapped into an improvised harness fashioned from more cable and climbing rope. They flashed colors indicating resignation mixed with terror as the cable went taut and began pulling them upward. The ascent took 10 minutes of steady hauling, during which everyone tried not to imagine the various ways this could fail catastrophically. When Preen disappeared into the canopy without screaming, The others took it as a positive sign. Quillix went next, essentially getting towed upward since they could float but not climb effectively. Kern required a more complex harness to avoid putting stress on their crystalline joints, but eventually rose into the branches. Jolpak went last, his forearms gripping the cable with white-knuckled terror as Morrow hauled him up using a pulley advantage that made physics do most of the work. When Jolpak finally reached the platform and could observe what Morrow had built, his computational abilities ceased trying to process it. The human had lashed together branches ranging from wrist-thick to thigh-thick into a framework roughly 3 meters square. Cross-bracing provided structural integrity. A railing fashioned from thinner branches and cable prevented accidental falls. The whole structure nestled in the fork where several major branches met, distributing weight across multiple load-bearing points. It was primitive. It was crude. It was also clearly engineered with actual understanding of stress distribution and material properties. Somehow, in under 2 hours using nothing but salvaged materials and equipment originally intended for soil sampling, Morrow had built something that looked functional. "This is impossible," Jolpak stated, running calculations. "The structural integrity shouldn't. It works because I built it to work," Morrow interrupted, not unkindly. "Humans have been building tree structures for about 50,000 years. You pick up some tricks. Now, the good news, we're about 30 meters up, which puts us in the mid-canopy layer. I can see sky through gaps in the upper canopy. The better news, I spotted what looks like a ridgeline to the east, which means we're not completely lost. The bad news, ground team is not reaching base camp without aerial extraction." The team absorbed this information while trying not to think about the 30-meter drop to either side of their platform. Preen had turned a color indicating impressed horror. Quillix floated in the center of the platform, unwilling to approach any edge. Kern's crystalline structure caught what little light filtered through the canopy, creating prismatic patterns across the branches. "So we signal for rescue and wait?" Quillix asked, their species' natural optimism asserting itself. "We signal for rescue," Morrow agreed. "But our communicators aren't getting signal through the canopy interference. I need to build higher, get above the heaviest coverage, and rig some kind of signal amplifier." "Which means you're building more Treehouse," Jolpak finished, his translator somehow conveying the special kind of exhaustion that came from watching humans solve problems. "Of course you are." Over the next planetary rotation, the impossible structure grew. Morrow worked with focused intensity, moving through the branches with confidence that made non-arboreal species nauseous just watching. They incorporated more salvaged equipment, using metal poles from the sample collection kits as structural supports and solar panels as platform flooring. The basic shelter evolved into something approaching an actual building, spreading across 3 separate trees and rising another 15 meters. The other team members contributed where they could. Jolpak's forearms excelled at knot tying and cable management once he mastered his fear of heights. Preen identified branches strong enough to serve as supports, using some botanical assessment technique that relied on analyzing bark pigmentation. Kern mapped the tree structure with sonar, identifying optimal attachment points. Quillix served as a lifting platform for materials, their floating ability suddenly extremely useful. But Morrow remained the driving force, the one who understood instinctively how to work in 3 dimensions while dangling over drops that could reduce most species to paste. They built stairs from lashed branches, platforms at strategic intervals, and even incorporated a rope bridge connecting 2 trees because apparently human engineering couldn't resist being needlessly elaborate. On the second platform level, Morrow established what they called the Operations Center, which consisted of their salvaged equipment, arranged on a relatively stable section of floor. The communication equipment, while unable to punch through the canopy interference, could still reach Ven at base camp if they could amplify the signal and get above the worst of the obstruction. "I need to go higher," Morrow announced, studying the canopy overhead. "Another 15 meters should break us above the dense layer. Then I can rig an antenna using equipment poles and our cable. That places you 60 meters above ground," Kern observed, their sonar painting the vertical distances involved. "Human survivability at that height in case of falls is approximately 0%. "Yeah, I'm aware," Morrow interrupted. "But unless someone else wants to volunteer for the climb, I'm it. Besides, I've climbed higher back home. There's this mountain range called the Rockies, and one time during a rescue operation, they stopped, apparently recognizing that now wasn't the time for anecdotes about previous near-death experiences. Point is, I'll be careful. The climb to 60 meters took most of a day. This far up, the branches thinned considerably. Morrow moved deliberately, testing each handhold before committing weight. The others watched from below, with a mixture of concern and morbid fascination. Quillix provided a safety line, floating beneath Morrow's position ready to catch them if they fell, which everyone politely pretended might actually work, despite physics suggesting otherwise. At the upper reaches, where branches became flexible and the canopy finally broke into patches of actual sky, Morrow established their final platform. This one measured barely large enough for a single person to stand, but it served its purpose. They began assembling the antenna using equipment poles lashed together in a vertical array, incorporating communication equipment and salvaged tech in ways that would make actual engineers weep, but which possessed a certain practical genius. The signal booster consisted of solar panels arranged as signal reflectors, communication equipment daisy-chained to amplify output, and a makeshift directional antenna pointed toward where Morrow estimated base camp should be. It looked like the kind of improvised technology that shouldn't function, the sort of desperate engineering that emerged from necessity rather than design. When Morrow activated it, the communication equipment crackled, buzzed, then suddenly resolved into Ven's shocked voice, demanding to know where the team had vanished to and why they'd gone dark for 47 hours. The subsequent conversation took considerable time, largely because Ven initially refused to believe they were 30 meters up in trees, living in something Morrow kept insisting on calling a treehouse. When Morrow finally provided visual feed from their equipment showing the structure's extent, Ven's response consisted of approximately 4 minutes of continuous swearing in 3 different languages. "You built this," Ven finally managed. "In 2 days, while lost in hostile jungle." "Technically 2.5 days, Morrow corrected. "And hostile is a strong word. The jungle wasn't actively trying to kill us, it just made existing at ground level impossible. So we went vertical. Problem solved." "Problem not solved." Ven's voice climbed registers. "You're sitting in trees. How does that solve? We're alive, we're in communication, and we have shelter with visibility." Morrow interrupted calmly. "Those are solutions. What we need now is extraction. The ground situation is untenable for the others to hike out, so we need aerial pickup. Can you coordinate with the orbital survey ship?" Ven muttered something untranslatable, but agreed to arrange extraction. The connection terminated, leaving the team to wait while rescue operations were organized. This process took another full planetary rotation, during which the treehouse continued evolving. Morrow added rain covers using emergency shelter material. Preen started a vertical garden, cultivating local plants that could supplement their supplies. Jolpak established a watch rotation, and began documenting everything with the obsessive detail his species brought to any activity. Kern spent considerable time analyzing the structure's engineering, running sonar scans and stress calculations. Their findings, later submitted to the Expedition Corps' Engineering Division, would spark intense debate. The Treehouse, despite being constructed from primitive materials using improvised techniques, demonstrated weight distribution and structural integrity that met or exceeded safety specifications for permanent installations. It shouldn't have worked, but it did, and the reasons why revealed something about human engineering philosophy that other species found both impressive and mildly terrifying. When the rescue shuttle finally arrived, its pilot spent 10 minutes hovering near the canopy, trying to understand what they were seeing. The treehouse had grown into a multi-level structure spanning 3 trees and rising from 30 to 60 meters above ground. Platforms connected via rope bridges. The antenna array at the top bristled with improvised technology. Solar panels caught sunlight on the upper levels. The whole thing looked like someone had taken a habitat module apart and reassembled it wrong, except it clearly functioned because 6 expedition members currently occupied it without apparent distress. Command, the pilot transmitted back to the orbital survey ship. I'm looking at what appears to be a permanent installation. Confirming this was constructed by the missing team in under 3 days. Affirmative, came the reply. The human built it. Apparently this is normal behavior for their species under stress. The extraction process required careful coordination. The shuttle couldn't land in the canopy, so team members had to be winched up one at a time from the highest platform. Morrow insisted on going last, making final checks of the structure as if planning to return someday. When they finally rose into the shuttle, they cast one last look at the treehouse before the door closed. The structure would remain in the canopy for the next several years, gradually incorporated into the jungle's ecosystem as local species discovered this new environmental niche. Future survey teams would occasionally spot it during orbital scans, a ghostly outline visible through breaks in the canopy. Some proposed studying it as an example of human emergency engineering. Others suggested preserving it as a monument to species adaptability. Eventually the jungle would reclaim it, but for a time it stood as testament to what happened when humans encountered problems and decided vertical solutions beat horizontal surrender. Back at the orbital survey station, the debriefing lasted 6 hours. Officials wanted to understand exactly how a routine survey mission had transformed into a survival situation requiring the construction of an arboreal habitat. Morrow's explanation, delivered with the kind of matter-of-fact tone that made extraordinary events sound routine, didn't particularly satisfy anyone seeking dramatic narratives. We got lost. The ground became untenable, so we went up and built shelter. Humans have been doing this for millennia. I just applied standard wilderness survival principles in a vertical context. The other team members corroborated this account while adding their own perspectives. Kern's sonar recordings provided structural documentation. Jolpak's detailed logs captured the construction timeline. Preen's botanical assessments confirmed the material selection process. Quillick's contributed visual documentation of the build process that would later be analyzed by engineers across a dozen species. The Expedition Corps initially classified the incident as a near disaster requiring procedural review. Then someone in the engineering division actually examined the data and realized what they were looking at. The treehouse represented a case study in adaptive engineering, demonstrating principles that could be applied to habitat construction on worlds where traditional ground-level building proved impossible. Within 6 months, the incident report had been reclassified from procedural failure requiring review to innovation requiring study. Morrow found this entire reaction somewhat baffling. From their perspective, they'd applied basic wilderness survival skills to an unexpected situation. The fact that other species considered this remarkable said more about divergent evolutionary pathways than human exceptionalism. Every species possessed unique capabilities shaped by their evolutionary history. Humans just happened to have evolved climbing ability, tool use, and a peculiar tendency to view altitude as an opportunity rather than an obstacle. The Treehouse entered expedition training programs as a case study in creative problem-solving. Instructors used it to demonstrate how species-specific abilities, properly leveraged, could turn disaster into survival. The fact that the solution had emerged from human instincts didn't diminish its value. It simply highlighted the importance of diverse team composition. Next time a team got lost in impenetrable terrain, maybe the Quillix would float them to safety, or Kern's sonar would map an escape route through underground passages, or Preen would identify edible vegetation that solved their supply problems. Or maybe the human would just build something impossible that worked anyway. That seemed to happen with concerning regularity. The expedition community reached an unofficial consensus when humans suggested unconventional solutions to survival situations. Listening might be worth considering. Their plans sounded insane right up until they worked, at which point they became retrospectively obvious. Going vertical in a jungle shouldn't have solved navigation problems, but establishing altitude had provided visibility, communication capability, and defensible shelter. The logic was sound. It just required accepting that up sometimes answered questions posed by Lost. 3 months after the incident, Morrow received a commendation for innovative problem-solving under adverse conditions. The ceremony was brief, the recognition polite, and the accompanying bonus substantial enough to fund their next wilderness expedition back home. They accepted it all with the same practical attitude they'd brought to building the treehouse, thanked the appropriate officials, and immediately began planning their next core assignment. Because humans didn't build treehouses in alien jungles because they wanted medals or recognition, they built them because the alternative was staying on the ground where problems lived, and evolution had spent millions of years teaching them that sometimes the best response to danger was climbing towards safety and building something to make the high ground livable. The galaxy had learned this lesson slowly, through observation and occasional terrified awe. Humans adapted. They improvised. They looked at situations that should have killed them and asked, but what if we just build something? The treehouse on Verdantia 7 stood in the canopy long after its builders departed, a monument to the peculiar human approach to survival. Other species studied it, analyzed it, tried to understand the philosophy that birthed it. They ran calculations and simulations, attempting to reduce human innovation to equations and protocols. They missed the point entirely. The treehouse wasn't about calculations or protocols. It was about a species that had spent their evolutionary history climbing things they shouldn't, building things that couldn't work, and surviving through sheer stubborn refusal to accept that problems weren't solvable. The jungle eventually swallowed the structure, incorporating it into the ecosystem as new growth wound through platforms and branches. But the lesson remained, passed through expedition briefings and training modules. When humans go quiet and start looking around with that particular focus, give them some space and possibly some tools. They're probably about to build something that violates several engineering principles while somehow remaining structurally sound. The Galactic Expedition Corps updated their statistics. Their success rate remained at 99.7%, but now whenever human team members suggested unconventional solutions to survival situations, the response shifted from skeptical dismissal to nervous acceptance. Experience had taught them that let's build a treehouse was somehow a valid survival strategy, at least when humans were the ones suggesting it. The universe was large and strange and full of species whose evolutionary paths had gifted them wildly different capabilities. Some could echolocate through stone, some could compute faster than ship computers, some could photosynthesize or float or see in spectrums, others couldn't perceive, and some could look at 30 meters of tree trunk, a handful of cable, and a survival situation, then build a beacon that guided themselves home, while everyone else stood around wondering how physics had agreed to cooperate with such obvious madness. The galaxy accepted this as simply another Tuesday in the endless variety of existence. Humans built things, they climbed things, they survived things. Sometimes they did all three simultaneously, while making it look almost reasonable. Almost.